7:12 a.m.
It's a bit too early.
How's your hair look?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. We were doing an interview with someone yesterday, and you stopped him right in the middle of it.
I did. I had one piece of hair sticking straight up, and it's all I could see. And I just thought he was probably looking right at it, which he probably didn't notice it. But you just pulled it out for me, and we went on.
The things you'll do for the one you love is yank out a stray hair.
Welcome to What We Really Want, conversations about connection. Settle in and get ready for a great conversation. Let's talk about what we really want.
Welcome to What We Really Want. This is episode 12. The episode is called Change is Seldom Spectacular, and I'm here with Stacey this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. It's too early.
It is pretty early when we're recording this, but we've got a busy week going on and a busy weekend. This whole week, I've been getting my days wrong, like not knowing what day it is. I think it's every end of the month, like the last couple of days. It's just let's just finish this month and get the next one going. I keep saying that the seasons don't really mean much to us anymore because we're empty nesters. We don't have kids in school or at home or anything like that. But we have had a good summer. You got to have a little bit of your happy place of Christmas in July.
Christmas in July for about a day. Yep.
And that of course is
one of our radio stations here plays it for a day. And I don't know if it's different every summer, but it was July 25th, I think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was fun. Just listen to it for a day and dream of when it's going to be cooler because we're melting down here.
This summer, our routine hasn't changed that much, but we did get to keep our grandson, Owen, for a while his parents were serving at a church camp.
I mean, we are just obsessed with him. As all grandparents are, I think.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say we're obsessed with this podcast, but we sure are excited about it. And some of the amazing guests that we've had, and they've been so gracious to give their time and to have conversations with us. And the one that we're excited about that you're about to hear was with a friend named Sharon Hersh. She is a therapist and an author, former college and seminary professor. But Sharon wrote a book, I think it came out in 2008, called The Last Addiction. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Sharon, it was because The Last Addiction was pretty important for you when our recovery journey was just starting back in 2009, right?
Yes. I didn't realize that book had only been out about a year. And I don't remember who brought it to my attention to encourage me to read it, but I just remember it being so life-changing, dealing with like finding out about your addiction. Kind of early on, I started to see things about myself that were completely separate from your addiction and not in any way. I'm not saying at all that these things were why you were a sex addict. But for me, in time, I was able to start seeing some of my own unhealthy habits, patterns, and this book, I think it just helped me see just such a broader picture that it's just not just about the addict. We all have things that we choose to do that are trying to fulfill a need. And I'm not even saying whatever you run to is the same as a sex addict or the same as, an alcoholic. What's the same is that we're all looking for something. And what that thing is that we use to try to fill the need is what's different. And so, I don't know, it was just super impactful for me.
Something that Sharon kept talking about that you'll hear in our conversation is just the word connection. And obviously, connection is something that this podcast is all about. And Sharon, in telling her own story of alcoholism and recovery, and just in her work with therapists and family members, talks about how easy and tempting it is to just disconnect from ourselves and from other people, because it's hard. I mean, it's hard when you're struggling with something to stay in that place of connection and vulnerability. But what happens when we try to create somewhere that's safe is what we're really just doing is creating somewhere that's isolated and lonely. And I think that really resonated with you, didn't it?
I'll just read some of the things. This book looks at their hard realities and possible redemption within substance abuse, but addiction reaches much further. And this first one is the one that just got me. The good church woman whose eyes are lined with fatigue and whose heart is filled with frenzy, but she still cannot say no. Because I couldn't say no.
Yeah. Sharon, several times in the conversation, used a variation of the phrase, if you struggle or if you love someone who struggles, if you struggle with an addiction or if you love someone who has an addiction. And I think that just that wide canvas that she stretches out to say, if you're not an addict, don't stop listening, don't check out, because these two experiences that she talks about in the book is a desire for escape and a desire for control. And if we really think about it, those are desires that every single one of us in some form can relate to, because when we have painful or difficult experiences in life, who wants to voluntarily sit in that? One of the things that she says is the bad news I have to deliver is that we suffer to get better, and the avoidance of pain, the numbing of pain makes all the sense in the world, whatever the pain is, but it doesn't get us any closer to that place of connection, which is how we were created to live.
Yeah. One of the things she says in this introduction is talking about telling our own story. And that was, again, something that connected with me, because I didn't want our story to be your sex addiction and your recovery, because that makes me feel like, one girl put it years ago, collateral damage. Like, you've got this story and it's affecting me. And so like, now what are we going to do with this couple? And so, we'll tell this story. But she says, as we see more clearly our own hearts and our longings for intimacy, we will be able to put words to the lengths we will go to kill, satisfy, control, or find substitutes for those longings. So I think, addict or not, we all fit in one of those categories.
Yeah.
And I just think that's the point. Like, being able to recognize those things and share your story, it has changed my life.
So many different good takeaways from the contribution that Sharon has made through her books, through her speaking. And so we're really thankful that she took some time to be on an episode. We hope that you'll enjoy it. And also drop us a line. In the show notes, you'll find ways to connect with Sharon. You'll find ways to reach out to us, take advantage of any of the recovery resources that Awaken offers. You're in for a great conversation. Here it is with Sharon Hersh. Sharon Hersh, it's so great to meet you, and thank you for being on the podcast today.
I am excited about what you're doing and really glad to be with you.
Yeah, I've known who you were for a long time and have just been aware of the impact that you have on people who are seeking recovery from addiction, and have wanted to meet you. And I feel like you're one of those people that I sort of almost know, because we've been Facebook friends for a while, and we'll like each other's posts and comment on each other's posts, but we'd actually never talked until today.
So this is a great way to start off meeting face to face.
Absolutely. So I know what I want, but I'd love to know what you really want out of our conversation today, Sharon.
Well, I was intrigued when I learned that the theme of your podcast is connection, which is focusing on a solution, in my opinion. And often in the counseling world, which I am a therapist, and in the world of dealing with challenges and addiction and trauma, we are so good at focusing on the problem, which is necessary. But then when it comes to the solution, there may be one chapter at the end of a book, or a few steps, which can be good. But I am assuming from the theme of your podcast that you are pursuing a robust journey into what the solution to these problems looks like. And I do believe there's a solution.
Yeah.
And I know that people who are stuck in addiction, or who love people who are dealing with, whether it's a bad habit or a full-blown addiction, or trauma responses that show up as addictive or self-destructive behavior, we all are desperate to believe there's hope.
Yeah.
So what I'm looking forward to talking about is hope.
Yeah, I love that. And your assumption is correct. I mean, I really think that if we, like you've said so well, if we focus more attention on the solutions, then it's not like the problems are going to automatically take care of themselves, but it becomes far less overwhelming when we are identifying what is it that I've really been looking for in this disordered way, in this sideways attempt. And when I can identify what I really want, then I can move towards that. To me, that's more successful than constantly trying to move away from something. It's kind of playing offense in life rather than just defense. So,
very well said.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be fun. So, Sharon, first thing I want to say at this point is just by way of a thank you. My wife, Stacey, who founded Awaken with me, was reminding me shortly before we started recording today that The Last Addiction was one of the first books that she read when all of our stuff was getting started 15 years ago. And she read it as a betrayed spouse. I couldn't probably quote a lot of the things that were meaningful, but it's just the whole thing. She was open and she was really interested not just in watching me get better, but in looking at, some of her own baggage and brokenness that she had carried in the relationship too. And she just found that was a book that was for everybody. So yeah, she just wanted me to pass along a thanks to you for writing it and for it being there when she needed it.
I'm so encouraged to hear that. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Of course. Yeah. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your life currently. And then in a minute, I'm going to ask you to tell us about, parts of your life that got you to where you are currently. So you've already mentioned that you're a therapist. Tell us a little bit about what you do, where you do it, and just, help us get to know you a little bit.
Okay. I am, by profession, a therapist. I've been a therapist for over 20 years and do a lot of work in the area of recovery, addiction, trauma, and helping families. So that's why Stacey's story is so encouraging and appropriate, helping families not necessarily identify the addict in their family and the problem child, but to know that often we face or we have people that we love who struggle with addiction, and we think it's all about saving them, which we don't save anyone. That too is about our own transformation, which really brings me to the season I'm in my life personally, which I have 2 adult children. Everyone in my family has struggled with addiction. And I have learned from a whole new perspective I have been the addict. Certainly when I wrote The Last Addiction over 15 years ago, it was about my own journey into recovery. Mm-hmm. And now as I'm walking alongside my adult children who have struggled with addiction, I learned, there's more transformation that needs to be done in me. God often gives us loved ones who are struggling to change us. Mm-hmm. But we can accept that and give up that savior complex, and that it's our job to save people. First of all, there's rest, but it's a whole new perspective on what can be done in our own lives, even if we're not the one struggling with addiction.
We'll be right back.
How have things gotten so out of control? How did something that didn't seem like such a big deal at first completely take over? Porn and sex addiction are destroying your life and killing your relationships. You know you can't keep going on like this, keeping secrets and telling lies. Something has to change. But how? Most men who struggle with unwanted or addictive sexual behavior have tried to fix it on their own. But sex addiction is powerful and complicated. Recovery is possible, but it isn't easy. It requires us to focus on more than just behavior. It requires us to look at our whole lives and the parts of our stories that contribute to addiction. If you're ready to find freedom, maybe it's time for you to get to the roots. The Roots Retreat is a 4-day therapeutic and spiritual intensive. You'll work with therapists and coaches who specialize in sex addiction and recovery. You'll learn how to take healthy ownership of your behavior. You'll discover how your life experiences set the stage for addiction to develop. You'll see how God factors into your struggle, and you'll learn effective tools for ongoing recovery after the retreat. If you're ready to stop trying what doesn't work, if you're ready to experience real hope, healing, and change, Let's get to the roots.
Visit awakenrecovery.com/roots retreat or click the Roots Retreat link in show notes. Yeah, that really struck me just now when you talked about walking with your adult children and their experiences with addiction, and you're experiencing a new transformation, you said, in your own life. And the first thought that brought to my mind is, wow, that's a new facet or a new perspective on step one, right? Admitting that we're powerless, that our lives have become unmanageable. And one of the parts of my life that I can't manage is managing other people's lives, right?
Yes. And so it has been probably a more painful and arduous journey to learn that not 1 ounce of me can save 1 ounce of anyone else. And that does not leave us in despair, because we still can love. But it's a whole new way of connecting. When I am connecting to save someone, when I am connecting because I have an agenda, that's not true connection.
Wow. Yeah.
And honestly, that is how most of our connections are formed. Agenda.
Okay.
Especially people who are struggling.
Coming in hot. I love it. Yeah, that's so good to hear. And I appreciate so much you sharing it. You referenced that in an earlier season, a lot of the focus was on your own story of addiction and recovery. And now it's shifting somewhat. I mean, we never stop focusing on our own story and our own recovery, but as much as you're comfortable, for people who aren't familiar with you and your story, tell us a little bit about how you came to be doing what you're doing now and to know yourself as a recovering person and just all the things you've learned through addiction.
Well, I was basically born in the choir loft, raised in the church, and went to Bible college and started my family with all the dreams and illusions that I could do it right. And along the way, had an undiagnosed mental health condition of anxiety. And that was back in the olden days when they really did not know a lot about anxiety. And so, believe it or not, my story with addiction begins in a doctor's office when a well-meaning doctor saw my anxious, uptight, perfectionistic, neurotic tendencies and said, if you were my wife, I would just tell you to go home and have a glass of wine. A doctor would not do that today, I do not think. But I had been a teetotaler until then. I had never drank, grew up in a family where there was not alcohol, did not know a lot of my story generationally beyond my parents, which is another important factor that comes into my story. But I went home from that doctor's appointment and was desperate. And that first glass of wine, I didn't know that not everyone who has their first glass of wine thinks, I have found the solution to life. I can be at home in my own skin. I'm going to do this every day. And I did do it every day. And it did make everything better until it made everything worse.
Yeah. And remind me again, how old were you when that first glass of wine experience happened?
I was 21 years old.
21. Okay.
Newly married and with a young husband desperate for me not to be anxious. I was desperate not to be anxious, and it worked until it didn't work. And I needed more and more, which is true of every addiction, to get the same result. And, it took a few years for me to learn that awful truth of addiction, that you can never get enough of what you don't really need.
Yeah. And
as I began to face this secret problem, because I drank in secret, I didn't go to bars, I didn't go to parties. I drank in my home in secret at night to deal with the stresses of life, which meant that my husband and I were not really communicating about our emotional world. We were not learning those foundational skills because we were numbing everything. So it took a few years for me to begin to have this nagging sense that this is not normal and this is becoming a problem, but I didn't know who to talk to about it. At the same time, being raised in a fairly legalistic religious foundation, I felt that at best, if people knew what was going on with me, they'd think I was a terrible person. And at worst, they would walk away from me completely. So I was stuck.
Yeah, it really struck me something that you said a minute ago, because it reminded me of a quote. I've been listening to the audiobook of Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal, which came out a few years ago, and he was quoting Vincent Felitti, who said it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. You know, and yeah, I mean, that's what you're describing, and something that works until it doesn't. And you said that a few years in, you started to notice, I'm assuming, kind of the effects of the law of diminishing returns. You know, it's not doing for you what it once did.
You know, there were relational disturbances, and I felt like a hypocrite at church, and one person one place and another person another place. And I was worried what could be happening to my health, and at the same time avoiding looking at anything that might warn me. And I will say probably it was God continuing or beginning to do for me what I could not do for myself. This increased anxiety when I was not under the influence, and the sense of impending doom, of being found out, that made me one day find a counselor's name at the bottom of an article in a magazine who happened to be in my vicinity. Was about a 50-minute drive, but I thought that was far enough away that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. And walked into this counselor's office not knowing anything about counseling, not knowing how I would even begin to tell this story. And there was some bumbling around at first, but, you know, eventually he said, well, I think you should just start telling a few people that you're drinking too much and you want to stop. And I said, you don't get it. This is a secret that I can't tell anyone, or people will think I'm a terrible person. And out of all the sentences that he said to me, he summed up addiction, and he summed up the problem, summed up the solution, and the path that you're going down in this podcast, when he looked at me and he said, you must be so lonely.
Wow.
And that stopped me. It kept me coming back to him because he hooked something in my heart that was deeper than the anxiety and the desire to medicate that anxiety. It was the longing for true, authentic connection.
And that's so interesting, that the effect that had on you, because it, at the same time that it could have been something that he was perceiving in you, it was also just a safe thing for him to say, right? Because that's going to be true of virtually anyone who's coming in with a story like yours, because like Nate Larkin just said in a conversation that we had recently, we're all special, but none of us are unique. And that loneliness is universal, but we don't know that until we tell somebody.
It is.
I have a question for you about something you said earlier, the concept of it works until it doesn't. That's not like a single day when like, okay, up until this day it was working, and then starting this day it wasn't. You were describing a lot of overlap, right? There was some time when it already wasn't working. I mean, I guess you could say all the way back to the beginning, but when your awareness began to increase that it's not working, and yet it sounds like you were committed to continuing to consume because of what it was doing. What was it like to live in the space of, I'm starting to feel like this isn't doing it for me, but I don't know another way. I mean, that's just such a difficult place to live.
It's a tension that actually feeds addiction. Because, right, addiction is progressive. And so it's progressive in the sense that you need more and more. And so I watched the amount that I needed increase and think, I don't think this is good. I watched the anxiety until I could get my fix increase. And I thought, I don't think this is good. then there were the little lies I had to tell along the way, and the dissonance in my spirit of this is not who I want to be. But all of those things also fuel addiction because there's all the more to numb. And so it becomes this vicious cycle of needing more and more and actually getting less and less. And for a lot of us, then we arrive at this desperate point where we either decide to dig our heels in and work it out ourselves, or we acknowledge, as you mentioned earlier, that first step that what I'm doing is not working. And I am making my life messier and more unmanageable and more out of control than ever. And I need something that is bigger and stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that in my story, I resonate with what you just said. I imagine everybody who's listening who, regardless of the way that it's played out, that it's manifested, can say, yeah, that's it. That's it right there. That's what's been going on.
And I would also say that realization, for me anyway, was not this one-time moment where I like on my knees, this is it. I give up. I surrender. I wish I went that easily into recovery, but that's just not my story. And it's not the story of most people that I know, that it was a two-step forward, three-step back process that over a period of time and maybe becoming a little more informed about addiction and the toll it takes on the body, on relationships, on your emotional well-being. I also learned in this period of getting ready for recovery that my mother's birth mother, so my birth grandmother, we began to do a little research into the family, and I discovered that she had been an alcoholic and actually died of alcoholism at the age of 52.
Wow.
Did that stop me drinking? No, it didn't. But it was another piece in the puzzle of the life that was shaping up that I knew I did not want, but moving into something different also felt impossible.
So Sharon, you said that it wasn't just one event. There wasn't like one time that everything clicked. But there were some moments probably that were more punctuated, and like when you looked at them, holy cow, like what am I doing here? And one of those moments that you've shared about, and the first time I actually heard about it was in our mutual friend Andy Gullahorn's song, I Want to Be Well.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, you know, how many of us have gotten to be the subject matter for a verse of one of Andy's songs? You have, right?
Yeah, that was a surprise to me. But I had told that story at a conference that Andy and I were speaking at, that in those days of getting ready to surrender, you know, not just learning that my birth grandmother had died of alcoholism at a relatively young age. And she died a hopeless, hallucinating drunk, disconnected from all her family. And that was kind of like a malignant prophecy for me that I actually thought of in the moment you're referencing that happened many mornings. We set our trash cans out Sunday night for the trash people to pick them up early on a Monday morning. And many times on Sunday night, I would decide, this is it. I cannot do this anymore. And I would throw out that big bottle of vodka. It's interesting to me, I didn't pour it out. So that right there highlights the tension. I am desperate to stop, and I am desperate to continue numbing all of this constellation of emotion that I don't know how to feel. And many times early on a Monday morning before the trashman came, I would, in my bathrobe, walk out to the curb, pull that bottle out of the trash, and kneel down hiding behind the trash can. I don't know who I was hiding from, probably myself, and take a few more swigs before the trash collectors came. That desperate to stop and desperate
to keep going, right?
to stay disconnected, because the first person we disconnect from in addiction is ourselves.
Yes.
And it was terrifying to me to think, what if I'm connected to these feelings of sorrow and shame and guilt and failure and fear and anxiety again? How will I live without this thing that I want to get rid of? So I hope those who are listening who love an addict know that your frustration of why don't they just stop? If we could, we would. No one wants to live like that.
And when you begin to have clarity that the thing that is destroying you at the very same time, in a very legitimate, real way, has been your caretaker for all those years.
Oh, exactly.
It's not that simple.
You found a way to survive life.
Right.
And now it's killing you at the same time.
Right. And when survival is the gold standard and that's all we know, we don't have a universe where we can even imagine thriving. And so, yeah, if this has been the strategy that we've employed just to get through, then we don't see stopping as a way of being better. It's like, this is going to, the terrifying thing is I don't know what's going to happen, but I fear the worst.
I don't know if I will survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're right. For many of us, for various reasons, trauma from the past, our experience with the addiction, we are in survival mode. So not knowing if you will survive is a big risk. There has to be a level of desperation that takes you to what we call in my 12-step meetings, that jumping off point where you decide, I'm going to jump. I don't know where I'm going to land, but I don't want to live this way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Sharon, I mean, obviously we've been talking about this already, but I believe that if we're going to get what we really want in healthy connections, that can't happen unless we learn how to make ourselves vulnerable to other people, and which is terrifying, right? You've done a great job just even today, but you know, in your writing and then when you share and when you speak, of showing what that's like. So I want to transition, if we could, into spending a little bit of time talking about some of the things that you've written, particularly The Last Addiction, which I know has been out a while. It's been out, 15 or more years, right?
I think so, yes.
So in the book, one of the things that you say is, at the heart of every addiction are two jolts of charge: the belief that I deserve escape and the fact that I demand control. And those two words, escape and control, really resonated with me. It strikes me that escape and control are two things that I wouldn't think would be present or at least prevalent in healthy, connected relationships. I mean, is that kind of the point you're making?
They can't be. And so I think most people listening understand the escape part. And even in the most popular, prevalent thinking on addiction, that is what is emphasized with good reason. What is the pain that you're running from? And that is something that we have to understand, that something has energized us to believe, I can't bear this pain. For me, it was anxiety. Probably was rooted in a lot of other things, but I deserve escape from this. And I'm going to find it in a way that is certain, that is accessible, that is easy to obtain, and that works. But I think it's important to acknowledge that second jolt of energy that is not talked about very much in certainly literature on addiction. And there is always this energy of, I am going to be in control. And that may seem crazy because most addicts look like they're out of control, but that out of control reality begins with a sense of, I don't trust you. I don't trust this world. I don't trust God. And so if I don't trust God, I have to be God. And that means that I need to be in control. So you better believe I tried praying, God, take this anxiety away. God, help me not be anxious. God, give me peace. And I didn't get an answer.
Yeah, it remained.
That first sip of alcohol, I felt this is something I can do every day and I can control this.
Isn't that interesting? Thinking about the angst of praying, God, take this anxiety away. And I imagine you probably had a picture in your mind or in your emotions, in your nervous system of what that might feel like to be free from that. And I bet you after that first glass of wine, it was remarkably similar to what you'd imagined. Yeah.
You are exactly right. And so then that's why a lot of us get all twisted up of like, well, why didn't God make this better? And why did he even allow alcohol? And why did he program me and my DNA and my brain to be so receptive to this and put me in this situation where this happened? And once again, your podcast theme provides the answer because God is always moving us along to connection. It's the addict that believes I will find the solution to my problems in isolation.
Yeah. So with those two jolts of energy, escape and control, what do we believe is going to happen if we sit in it and don't escape?
We'll feel pain. And unfortunately, I mean, that's the bad news that I have to deliver is that we suffer to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Learning to feel anxious and calling a friend and saying, I don't know why, but I can't shake this today. And maybe we could go for a walk. It doesn't feel the same as a glass of wine, but there is something of life, what we were made for.
Yeah, it also doesn't feel the same afterwards as too many glasses of wine, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because we were not made to sit in a dark apartment watching reruns of Friends, drinking glass after glass until we are numbed out. We were made to be connected to other people, to share our struggles, to hear their struggles, to hear their successes, to share our successes, to know that we are not alone. And I can imagine people listening thinking, but you don't get it. I am alone.
Mm-hmm.
I've said that on days, Greg. I am alone. And that's why addiction is so enticing. It doesn't require anything of me. It is so disrespectful. It says you don't have to be anything, Sharon.
Disrespectful in the sense that it devalues you as a person by not calling you to live according to the purpose that God's given you. Is that what you mean, or something else?
Or according to my gifts, or according to my desires. Mm-hmm. It requires that it only asks that I be empty.
Which is often what we believe we are anyway.
Yes. And recovery does require something of me.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's what we believe will happen if we don't escape. We'll feel pain, and we will. It's not fatal, but initially there's maybe a belief that it will be. But what do you think that we fear?
And the truth is, Greg, I have to say this. There is pain in addiction too.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, that's a big fat lie.
Well, what's the old adage that, people recover when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of moving?
Exactly. So there's pain either way.
Right.
The difference is I can be in my pain with a half-empty bottle of alcohol, or I can be in my pain connected to self, to God, to others. And having experienced both, like you said so well, the aftermath of addiction is just more self-contempt, disgust, emptiness, where the aftermath of connection is beginning to hope. Maybe I am loved. Maybe I do have something to offer. Maybe my story is not a waste. Maybe there is more than the bottle.
So what do we fear or believe will happen if we lose or acknowledge that we don't have control? The other jolt.
So if anyone is listening and this is the thought in their head, if I do not take charge of this, no one else will. First of all, you need to know that's a trauma response. That is a result of being left on your own over and over and over again when you should not have been. So I hope for that person that they find someone that they can process that trauma with, that taught you to be a lone ranger, that it is all up to me. But so the fear we have is that if I don't take control of this, everything will fall apart because I can't trust anyone. But here is the kicker with that sentence. And if I can't trust anyone, I will never experience love. I'm going to say that again because I think it is such a dire state that many people who struggle with addiction find themselves in. If I can't trust anyone, I cannot experience love. That's not a way to live. Because we were made for love.
Well, that leads right into the next thing I was going to ask you, because you've talked a lot about the desire to feel and to believe that we belong. You know, you wrote a book about it called Belonging. And I think I know what you're going to say, but the question is there a relationship, or maybe better said, a correlation between how much or how little we feel we belong and how much we pursue escape and control?
Absolutely. And so then where do we find that sense of belonging? Many of us have been hurt by the church. We have families who we cannot trust and perhaps should not trust to find that sense of belonging. And so that vulnerability that you talked about as a precursor for recovery often begins with something that doesn't seem that vulnerable, but it's just simply finding someone that I can say help to. And I remember when I first entered inpatient treatment for recovery, I had a counselor who was probably 20 years younger than me. He had not graduated from college. I knew way more than him. I was awful, Greg. He would present me with things to read and I would say, oh, I've taught about that. I've read that. And one day we were sitting in his office and he happened to be a man of faith. And he said, Sharon, I was driving home yesterday and I was thinking about you and probably thinking, what in the world am I going to do with her? But he said, I was thinking about you and this thought came to me, I think, from God. And I felt like God was saying, would you give up your serenity for Sharon? Which I thought was the weirdest question. And I wanted to say, well, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm not really asking for anything from you. And he said, my immediate response was, yes, I would do that. And I was stunned and introduced to the reality that even though I was a woman of faith and probably did know more than him, at the same time, he sure knew a lot more about recovery and relationships than I did. And what he was saying was, Sharon, I'm willing to love you. And I left his office thinking, I don't know what to do with this.
That was probably a really helpful dilemma, wasn't it?
And I spent several hours wrestling with that. Like, am I going to trust this person to care about me? Which, even like I said, though I was a person of faith, I realized I needed a human person, an embodied person to be a bridge to understanding and believing that God cares for me. And that really was a turning point in my life of understanding that even briefly considering connecting was what I had been looking for.
Yeah. It strikes me that as you're talking about this, how much there's a tendency to form views of God based on negative experiences we've had with people. But then you're describing one where you had a positive and a thought-provoking and an emotional-provoking experience with a person that also projected onto God in a really healthy way, it sounds like.
Yes.
And just that sense of belonging, it makes me think back to something you shared just a few minutes ago. If we feel like and we really experience belonging and acceptance and presence with other people, then that can allow us to sit in that pain, without a need to escape. I think when you were describing like calling somebody and saying, hey, will you take a walk with me? I've really come to appreciate some things that the Jewish people have discovered in terms of like sitting with people who are in mourning. And how many times have you heard sermons about Job and his friends who came and sat with him for 7 days and before they started criticizing? And I always hear in the sermons, well, they got it right for the first 7 days and then they blah, 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 blah. But now I'm starting to realize they were only being quiet because the rules said you had to, right? Because you have to just sit in silence for a week. And they probably couldn't wait to start criticizing. But the thing that was comforting was just their presence. And the thing that strikes me about that is because I'm living as a broken person in a fallen world, I'm not in my eternal place yet. There are going to be some pains that aren't taken away yet. And what God does is he sits with me and gives me his presence rather than the removal of the pain. And when I can experience that from a person and it means something to me, then it's not going to feel like such a jip or an unfairness or an injustice when that's what God gives me. Because it's not that he's withholding, he's actually giving the best thing, which is his presence. I mean, does that ring true? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, I think we often have been taught that God is a dispenser and that if we put in the right coins or the right code, then he will dispense every good thing that we want.
Yeah.
But really, the only thing that God has to offer is himself. And that's why at this point, for those who are struggling or love someone who struggles, I can't promise a perfect community. But I cannot not recommend that you get involved in a recovery community, because generally people who are in recovery or love people who are struggling have learned this lesson that we really do need each other. That trying to go it alone, even for those of you who are trying to go it alone with God, you're probably just going it alone. We need other people who are walking a similar path, who have gone through similar heartaches and failures and ups and downs. I still need people. I still, Greg, sometimes will say, I don't know why I keep coming to these meetings. And I often will have people say to me afterwards, Sharon, I think you need to be here. And we want you here.
Wow.
And I need to hear those two things.
Oh, yeah.
Us and we need you. And that's the code right there.
That's the code. There's no cheat code. It's pretty plain. So that really beautifully leads me to my next question. I was going to read something else that you wrote in Last Addiction. Here's the quote. It says, what if we are in a dance of intimacy with ourselves, others, and God, a dance that heightens and unfolds through all the phases and seasons of our lives, even in the dark days of addiction. And this dance is the journey of redemption. That would mean that intimacy, connection, and belonging are not just the destination of the healing path, but that relationships themselves are the path. To see relationships as the healing path may seem unlikely when we've been hurt, abandoned, and betrayed by relationships, but they can be redeemed. Gosh, that's a beautiful quote. And I'm thinking about how much easier it is for you and I to sit here and talk about this today. Like we can say, well, of course, relationships can be redeemed. But the truth is, there have been times when that seemed a lot less clear or possible, right?
Absolutely. Times recent for me, not past. And in hearing the word intimacy repeated often in that quotation, I am often asked by my clients and loved ones who are struggling, well, I don't even know what intimacy is. What are you talking about? And I just go back to a simple Sunday school definition that I learned long ago. Intimacy is in to me, see. And if you don't know where to start, what's one thing that you're willing for someone to see? Maybe it's, I don't know how to be in a relationship.
Yeah.
That right there is the beginning of intimacy, because you've shown something inside of you and trust for it to unfold.
Just the other day, I was watching a comedy special on Netflix, and it was John Mulaney, and he was talking about his story of getting an intervention done on him by his friends and going to treatment. And he told the story about some of the work he was doing in treatment and having to write out a story of like an unmanageable or an insane thing that he had done. And it was the story of him spending $12,000 on a Rolex that he turned around and sold and pawned for $6,000 to go buy drugs. And it's a hilarious story, obviously with all of the embellishments and the way that he tells it. And at the end of it, he says, and by the way, lest you think, man, that's really messed up, just remember, that's a story I was willing to tell you. And that, like, I thought of that when you just said, just pick something. You don't have to pick the deepest, darkest thing that you've carried the most shame about. Start with something easier just to see what it feels like, right?
Right. And also know that if you are struggling with addiction, or you love someone who struggles with addiction, and you keep that a secret, because there's often a lot of shame with that you didn't get here in a few days, and you're probably not going to change your modus operandi in a few days either. I am not going to lie. It's work. But I can also tell you wholeheartedly, it's worth it. Because you are worth more than that, whether it's substance abuse or sexual addiction or gaming or social media. You are worth more than that isolated dark room with a bottle or a screen or an image, and your soul simmering in shame. That is not how we were meant to live.
So what would you say to a person who is willing to give it a shot and to lean into a recovery process, to lean into pursuing relationships, and they've just had their first relapse, and now they're saying, well, crap, I tried that and it didn't work. What do you say to a person who's there?
I would say that often when we stop addictive behavior, we're pretty quickly, usually within the first 2 weeks, reminded of why we chose that addictive behavior. And that the brain is primed. It is literally primed to anticipate, I know how to make this go away. So you stepped off the path, step back on. This is not about perfection. None of us have done it perfectly. I certainly have not. And when I have relapsed, I have learned, oh, there was something left to recover. And so grateful that this is, change is seldom spectacular, Greg.
I love that.
Maybe death, and even that is often not spectacular. Change happens over a lifetime. And so don't be committed to perfection. That's just the ego talking that you stepped off the path, step back on, be committed to progress.
So the takeaway I heard from a relapse and a failure is there is something left to recover.
Yes.
And that's good news.
It is.
That sure is an unusual and not a normal first perspective though, right? Following a failure.
Right. Because failure, it doesn't feel good. And often the people in our life are scared and frantic and scrambling. And that's why it's good to have a community of recovery, because they know what it's like to step off the path and will say, okay, get back on the path.
Yeah. And often they'll say it in a non-shaming way before we're ready to. And that's how we learn how to stop shaming ourselves, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. I love what you said. Change is seldom spectacular. That's probably going to end up being the title of this episode. That's awesome. If people, Sharon, want to find out more about the resources that you've put out there that have been so helpful, how would they find you? We'll put some links in the show notes, but just tell us a little bit about how people can find out more about your books and resources and therapeutic offerings that you have.
Thank you for asking. I do have a website. It's Sharon Hersh, and Hersh is Hersh, like Hershey. And then I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. That's about as far as I can go at this old age.
I'm with you.
Not hard to find.
Yeah.
And I do, especially if you are struggling or if you love someone and struggling and you are feeling hopeless, let me turn a light on for you. Reach out. Those are my favorite conversations to have.
Amen. Sharon, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great.
We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, feedback, topics you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, click the Send Us a Message link in the show notes of any episode.